Hey everyone, Jenna here. With the buff 600 RPM auto rifles were subjected to at the start of Season of the Worthy, they've become an extremely popular choice among the player base because of how awesome they are in the short and mid-range. These have an optimal TTK of 0.7 seconds that requires 7 crits and 1 body shot to achieve, and the body shot TTK of 1.2 seconds, requiring 0 headshots, which makes for very competitive and forgiving TTKs. Just to give you an idea of how much, 150 RPM hand cannons, the second most popular primary weapon archetype in the game, require 3 headshots to down an enemy with an optimal TTK of 0.8 seconds. If a single headshot is missed, 1 extra bullet will have to be shot, skyrocketing the TTK to 1.2 seconds. So in comparison, there's a lot of leeway when it comes to the amount of headshots one needs to hit with 600 RPM auto rifles to achieve any TTK between 0.7 and 1.2 seconds, unlike most of the other primary weapon archetypes in the game, where you're severely punished for missing headshots. The only other mid-range primary weapon archetypes with more competitive TTKs are 340 RPM pulse rifles with a better optimal TTK of 0.67 seconds that requires 6 crits and 1 body shot, and 720 RPM auto rifles with a better body shot TTK of 1.17 seconds, requiring 0 headshots. Though they aren't as popular on PC as on console, auto rifles are the most used weapon type on console and almost as popular as hand cannons on PC. Let's take a look at the competitive playlist to better illustrate by how much. Now, I'm focusing on this playlist specifically because it's one of the few places where you're punished for losing. So winning is the end game in every match, which means players will use every advantage they can to secure the win, making it a great place to spot what players consider to be the deadliest options. As of the recording of this video, on the PlayStation 4, around 27% of players main an auto rifle, while 22% use hand cannons. On Xbox, it's around 26% and 24%, respectively. As for the PC, 32% of players use hand cannons while 20% prefer an auto rifle. Although I didn't focus on any of the casual playlists, I'd like to let you know that if I did, the numbers would have been skewed even more towards auto rifles. As a quick example, when it comes to control on the PlayStation 4, around 35% of players use auto rifles while 16% use hand cannons. On the Xbox, it's around 34% and 16%, respectively. While on the PC, auto rifles are actually the most used weapon type with 28% versus a 24% of hand cannons. Now, from all the auto rifles used, the 8 most popular ones all around are 600 RPMs, with the first non-600 being Misfit with only 0.2% of use. Because of how pervasive 600 RPMs have become and how good they are as a whole, discussions have been brewing among members of the community for or against a future nerf. Though Hardlight, the de facto king of the meta for a while, was subjected to a nerf which saw its usage dip tremendously, it wasn't enough to do much to change the meta, other than opening it up for different 600 RPM offerings in the game instead of being so heavily focused on a single auto rifle. So there's still a bigger discussion to be had here about 600s, but it can't be done just by looking it through the lenses of balance and ways to outplay this archetype. It doesn't matter that you can outplay auto rifles by using peak shooting with hand cannons. It's easier for the general population to just pick up an auto rifle and spray opponents instead of having to learn a different technique that I only see advanced players using to achieve an inferior optimal TTK. It doesn't matter that you can succeed against 600 RPM users if you change your approach. It's easier for players who can't or don't know how to do so to either complain, quit in frustration, or just switch to a 600 RPM than it is to change how they naturally approach an encounter, even if done wrong. It doesn't matter that you can use range to your advantage against a 600 RPM, much like Luna's Howl showed us so very well when it completely dominated the meta on console. None of this matters because players are focusing on granular aspects of the game that have failed to put any type of dent on the 600 RPM meta, and because of that, won't matter when talking in favor or against the meta that is so clearly defined. We have to look elsewhere. Matchup charts pick rate, and player feedback are ultimately the main aspects that will have any power in deciding the fate of this 600 RPM meta. And this can actually come sooner rather than later if DMG's tweets are something to go by. Win rates can be misleading just by themselves. Just in Season of Dawn, a lot of players complained a ton about Nova Warp and how broken handheld Supernova was, just to find out that it were actually top 3 Stormcaller users who were getting the most wins out of any Warlock subclass in the game. Though handheld was really powerful and Nova Warp was the most used Warlock subclass in the game, it was being outplayed by a subclass that wasn't as popular and seemed to be a bit more balanced. So if Bungie only took win rate in consideration, we would have never seen a nerf to handheld Supernova. So win rates have to always be accompanied by matchup charts. Matchup charts can be used to showcase the win rate of a weapon type, weapon archetype, class or subclass against other options within the same realm. Though we don't know if this is something Bungie uses to have a better understanding of how different options compete against each other, I believe it's safe to assume they do, since it's a staple of modern game design when it comes to asymmetrical multiplayer games. These charts can give a better idea of how really effective something is. It gives the developer context, though even this can be misleading in its own way.
Riot had a problem with the League of Legends character, Akali. The numbers said she was pretty balanced, with a 44% win rate, perhaps a tad underpowered. So how come she secured a 72% win rate at the 2018 World Championship and was banned more times than any other champion? It's because while she was really powerful, she was difficult to play effectively. She had a super high skill floor, in other words. So while top tier players could use her to wipe the floor with the competition, the low ranking players using Akali were getting killed left, right and center. Therefore, her win rate was being dragged down. That's why it's important to look at a character's win rate and matchups across all skill levels.
While matchup charts aren't usually shared with the player base, there are 2 measurements of balance that we have access to: pick rate, or how widely used something is, and player feedback. The issue with widely used subclasses or weapons is that they make for a stale meta, whether they are game-breaking or not. From the point of view of a company running a live service, it's a no-no. You want to create interest and force the player hand to keep the game fresh so players keep coming back for more. That's what Bungie did with 600 RPMs this season. Because they couldn't nerf hand cannons anymore without making them utterly useless, they forced the 600 RPM meta on the player base by making them too good to pass on. And so, hand cannon usage, and especially Luna and Spare Rations usage, went down, which have been the dominant primary weapon meta for a very long time, alongside the last word. You see, nerfs and buffs aren't necessarily used to just balance things out for the sake of fairness, and can be used as tools to freshen up the game by weakening what's meta-defining and is ultimately making the game stale, boring, and in the worst case scenarios, frustrating, or strengthening things to make them more appealing than the current meta, or at the very least make them able to better counter the meta, and all of this regardless of the meta's real power. Meta has as much to do with perception as it has to do with real power. Erentil is a great example of this. Although the gun had been very strong since Forsaken launched, pretty much no one was using it. Power didn't matter here, because the perception about the gun's power was that it wasn't enough to warrant usage. So, although it wasn't balanced, since no one was using it or complaining about it, there was no need to nerf it. Only when it became the talk of town among players who were streaming or making videos for YouTube did it start gaining some traction, finally making its way into the meta. Only when this switch in perception happened did we see an increase in complaints and usage, which ultimately sealed its fate. Going back to handheld Supernova, the combination of a high pick rate when it came to Nova Warp and especially player feedback seemed to have been the main catalyst behind its nerf at the start of Season of the Worthy, since win rate didn't signal it as a problem and matchup charts could possibly be showing it as being balanced enough against other subclasses in the game. So while we don't have access to win rates and matchup charts, we have ample access to pick rates and general player perception about the 600 RPM auto rifle meta. Like I mentioned before, 600 RPMs are dominating player choice As far as perception goes, it seems like generally speaking, these are considered the best primaries in the game by the majority of the population. And these guns do have the power, ease of use, and forgiving and fast TTKs to back it up. There's a lot of complaining, and there's little to no room to buff other things to compete in terms of TTK without breaking the game. Bungie can make other things more forgiving to counter 600 RPMs, but at the end of the day, those will still have slower TTKs among other limitations. And the fact of the matter is that the game already has forgiving archetypes that play in the same range as 600 RPMs, like 540 RPM pulse rifles, but have since disappeared from the meta and have a hard time competing. So just buffing other things won't be enough. Hardlight got nerfed because of how incredibly good and dominating it was over the meta. From there, Bungie will probably nerf Suros next, or just move on to nerf 600s as a whole. But to me, one thing's for sure, the nerf to 600s isn't a question of if, but of when and how.